The latest data from the CDC shows 4.5 million children in the U.S. are diagnosed to have a behavior problem. 4.4 million have diagnosed anxiety, and almost 2 million are diagnosed with depression. In today's show, we hear from this child psychologist about the connection between mood, behavior, anxiety, and nutrition.
The pandemic has thrown a whole nother layer on top of that. And so you've got this chronic inflammation where the body is not working the way that it's supposed to. You notice increased anxiety and depression. You notice problems with foggy thinking and focus. Maybe your hair starts falling out. Your nails are more brittle. No kid wakes up in the morning and says, you know what I'm going to do today is really just be a problem, make everyone's life miserable. Like, no kid does that.
Stay tuned to the end of the show to learn how to make this Valentine's Day Chinese New Year craft and recipe. And this week for our Actions of Aloha segment, we want to let you mamas know about an online Hawaiian school for keiki and adults called Kahale Ho'aka. The online programs teach Hawaiian language, music, hula, arts and crafts, culture, and ancient wisdom. It's online learning for the whole family during this pandemic safer at home time. They have a low-cost program and also free video lessons on YouTube. That's Kahale Ho'aka Online Hawaiian School. And now for our main segment with Dr. Nicole Beurkens about anxiety, depression, and stress for children. It seems, and I've read about this, that anxiety, depression, even suicide has been on the rise for children. But now that we're in the pandemic, everything's heightened even more.
Yeah.
So what happens in the body when we're in that stress response?
First of all, pre-pandemic, we were seeing an increase, particularly for older children and teens, in the rates of anxiety disorders, depressive disorders, things like ADHD, even suicidality, increases in that over the last decade. Then the pandemic came around, and now, and we're getting research out every day on, what they've been tracking since March, really. And what we're seeing is that those numbers are going up even more, particularly for our adolescent and young adult populations. Now, that makes sense, not so much that there would suddenly be this huge increase in the number of kids with intrinsic mental illness, but just that you put any human being in a really challenging, abnormal environment and situation for long enough, and it's going to have an impact on us. So the impact of the pandemic makes sense, but even prior to that, we were seeing increases, and there's lots of theories. One of the theories in general about why we're seeing such an increase in the prevalence of everything from autism and ADHD to depression and anxiety in kids is because of just an increase in a toxic environment. Increase in environmental toxins in the air, in the water, pollutants that kids are exposed to all the way from conception through birth and then through their development. Looking at increased toxicity and reduced nutrient density in the foods that we're eating. Even food grown in the soil in a garden or on a farm today is nutritionally less dense than 20 years ago, certainly than 50 years ago. And so we're seeing the impact that has on kids, along with a food supply now that is allowed to have a lot more chemicals, a lot more untested things in there, at least in the US, that we really are seeing a negative impact on kids from that. So those are pieces of it, combined with the increase in digital technology and exposure to screens and all of the things, both physically as well as emotionally and developmentally. This is the first generation of kids really being raised in front of devices. So that is an issue that we see that's playing into all of that. Changes in school, really a reduction in developmental appropriateness for school compared to 20 years ago, 30 years ago, 50 years ago. What used to be our kindergarten and first graders used to be engaged in a lot of play and developmentally appropriate hands-on activities. Now we have preschool already focused on learning letters and numbers and sitting still and doing worksheets. And so there is definitely a research-based argument to be made that has had a negative impact on kids. So all of these pieces, it's not one thing that has led to this increased prevalence in these kinds of issues, but it's being aware of all of these pieces. And there is no doubt that these components are having a negative impact, not only on children's physical health. The most recent study that was done, and this was already several years ago, shows us that 54% of children in the United States have some chronic health diagnosis. Now, that can be anything from asthma or allergies or chronic constipation to things like ADHD, autism, those kinds of things. But 54%, that's over more than half. And it's probably much more now. That study is several years old. So we know that that's the case and that that's increasing. And you can ask any teacher who's been teaching for 20 years or more what their experience was at the start of their career with kids in their class, both from a physical health and a mental health and learning standpoint, and what they're seeing now. And it's night and day. And so we know that that has been a trend, unfortunately, that has been increasing across the board. And then the pandemic has obviously added a layer to that, with taking away just the normalcy, the certainty, the stability, the activities, all of that. We're seeing, particularly, like I said, our teens and our young adults struggling. So, all of that leads us to a place where we have more and more kids who need support, who need help. I think there's a recognition right now with the pandemic that, hey, just focusing on, putting your child in some form of outpatient counseling is probably not going to cut it, especially in an environment now where a lot of those supports are not really that accessible. So it brings the question to the forefront then, as parents, what can we be doing? What do we need to be knowledgeable about and empowered to do to really support the development, the physical health, and the mental health of our children?
Well, let's get into what physically happens in the body, because I know a lot of kids who were actually doing okay, maybe not even stressed, and now they are in this very strange situation. They're either depressed because they're 100% distance learning, they're having hardly any social time, or they're fearful. I mean, I just talked to a college student in the last show who described everything she and her friends went through in college, and it was just overwhelming. If we understand what happens to our bodies, well, then we'll get into the nutritional support that we need based on all the different things that happen.
Yeah.
So what happens when we are under stress?
Yeah. So when we're under stress, that, people think of that as sort of a in the mind sort of thing. Oh, I'm feeling stressed. But actually, there's a very real physiological response that happens. And it's important to understand that the human body is designed to experience and manage stress. Stress actually can be a good thing. There's a range of stress, and our body is very well designed to handle stress in short-term, acutely stressful situations. That's a good thing, right? So whether it's a little kid who has to, go in for some kind of medical procedure that brings stress, the body's designed to handle that, or a college student who has a big presentation to give, or a parent who has something stressful going on for a short period. Our bodies are designed to do that. When we experience a stressor, anything internally or externally that causes us to go into a state of heightened alert is a good way of thinking about stress. The body responds to that and it goes, "Ooh, we got to be ready to handle this." And so things like heart rate go up, blood pressure goes up, temperature goes up. The body kind of gets in this activated, like, all right, we're going to handle this kind of mode, which is a good thing in the short term. One of the things that happens there as the body says, "Ooh, we need to be on alert, we need to get ready to handle this," is immune function is activated, because the body is very smart and it says, "Ooh, there might be an invader, there might be a threat. Let's get ready to, attack that to keep our body healthy." So the immune system activation goes up. There's a cascade of hormones that are involved in that. People often think of, cortisol and adrenaline. With that release of adrenaline is sort of what makes us feel anxious or kind of pumped up about something. Cortisol is the body's response to that sense of threat or just activation or stress. And it says, "Whoop, we need to be ready for this." So all of these things happen, and that is appropriate in the short term. But those mechanisms of the body responding to those stressful events or those internal stressors is only meant to last for a short time. So, you have the big presentation to give and then it's done and you go, okay. And that stressful trigger is done and the body goes, whoop, okay. The brain says, we're good now. The body settles down, everything goes back and it's like, whew, all right, we're good. The problem is when those stress responses stay activated in what we call a chronic state. So when we experience stress that is not just temporary, but that goes on long term, the best way to think of it is the body kind of burns itself out because those mechanisms are not meant to go on long term. So the longer we are in a state of heightened stress, whether that's emotional stress or physical stress, the body keeps pumping out adrenaline and cortisol, keeps, okay, we're ready, the immune system is activated, all right, but that can only keep it up for so long. And the longer that goes on, the more we start to have problems then as a result of that chronic stress. The immune system gets burned out. It's like, hey, we can't stay activated like this, and it tries, but it can't keep up. And so that's why people have the experience often if they've been in a longer term period of stress, they come out of that and they get sick. So the classic example, and I have 2 college students right now, is college students who push and push through the stress of getting through the end of the semester, taking exams. They come home for holiday break and the first thing that happens is they get sick, right? Or people, maybe if you're a listener who maybe has had the experience of taking care of a loved one who's ill for a while or something like that, and you push and you keep at it and you keep at it, and it's not until things start to recede that then your body, you're like, whoa, now I'm getting sick all the time. What's going on with that? Well, the immune system kind of burned itself out. It stayed in a heightened state for so long and it couldn't do it anymore. So that's why people in situations of chronic ongoing stress discover that they get sick a lot. They pick up every little illness and thing that's going around because their immune system is in this really depleted state. Some of the other things that happen, anxiety goes up. You think about it, the body is constantly then sending this hormonal and neurochemical signal to the brain that, whoop, there's something wrong here. And so we get in this constant state of ruminating. Our brain is overactive. We have the feeling of feeling amped up and anxious all the time because our blood pressure is staying higher, our heart rate is staying up, and that activates our brain to go, whoop, something, bad is going on here. Obviously, longer term, heart rate being up, blood pressure being up, that leads to issues with blood pressure, issues with heart health. We get issues metabolically with things like obesity, fat storage. When you're in this kind of sort of crisis mode or heightened anxiety or stress mode long term, the body says, whoo, we gotta, keep the reserves up. So it is much more likely that food that is eaten is stored as fat because the body goes, whoop, we got to really conserve here. So these are the reasons why, you see all of these kinds of physical and mental health kinds of things that happen. And really one of the big driving factors with it is something that we call inflammation. And inflammation is what happens when the body stays in this sort of fight or flight activated mode. And all of this builds up in the system and it literally causes the cells and the organ systems in our body to be inflamed. You think about, let's say you get a cut on your hand and you look at it and it gets kind of red, kind of puffy, it gets inflamed, right? That's the body's response. The immune system is sending all kinds of things there to help address that with the healing. That inflammation short term is good. But if something stays inflamed for a long time, that is not good. It opens up the body to all kinds of problems. And that's what happens with this chronic stress. And that's really what we're seeing, what we already were seeing in the population before the pandemic. There was evidence that people in general, kids and adults, are more inflamed than ever before because of high stress, diet, lifestyle, those kinds of things. But now the pandemic has thrown a whole nother layer on top of that. And so you've got this this chronic inflammation where the body is not working the way that it's supposed to, digestion isn't working the way that it's supposed to, things that aren't supposed to leave the digestive tract are now seeping out into the body and the brain and causing all kinds of problems, because on a cellular level, the body's kind of puffy. These cells are puffed up and angry and inflamed, and they're not functioning the way that they should. And unlike an acute thing where somebody might say, well, how do I know I have inflammation? Like, I didn't notice, I didn't feel anything. Well, no, it's sort of this process that happens over time, and you don't notice. It's not like any one moment where you go, oh, I suddenly feel inflamed, but you notice all of these signs. You notice increased anxiety and depression. You notice problems with foggy thinking and focus. You notice that you're gaining weight even without changing your diet. You notice that you're a lot more fatigued. Maybe that you're having trouble with temperature regulation. Maybe your hair starts falling out. Your nails are more brittle. Like all of these things that we kind of see that creep up on us over time. And it's just important to understand that that entire process, that brain-body connection with how we experience stress and how our brain and our body manage that, that impacts everything about our health and our functioning, and for our kids as well. And so a lot of the things that we see with them are wrapped up in this process of inflammation due to chronic stress, chronic inflammation in their system.
I'm thinking about all of that with the nutritional support that we need that we've never needed before. I always used to think, I'm just going to cook a balanced meal, home cooked, by scratch. It's all going to be good. Like, get organic, grow my own. But it's not enough, especially what we're going through. So can you explain a little bit about that?
Well, I think all the things you're talking about are an excellent foundation, but really at the root of this is changes in the gut microbiome that impact how nutrients from our food are getting into the cells of our body where they can be used. Well, food goes in and somehow our body uses it, and that's a great thing, right? Well, there's a whole complicated process involving a lot of aspects of digestion, of breaking that food down. And a big part of that, the microbiome, is that community of microorganisms. So bacteria and viruses and fungi and all kinds of components in there. And some people might be thinking, wait a second, that's in my body. Yes. That's an entire, community there. And I know you've done a great episode on the gut microbiome with Karan Christian, a microbiologist. But that balance is really important. We have all of those microorganisms all throughout our body, but particularly in our gut, that support everything about how we digest our food, how we use our nutrients, how we produce neurotransmitters, those chemicals that allow our brain to function well, that regulate everything like, blood sugar levels and all of those things. One of the things that aggravates the gut microbiome and throws it out of balance and causes problems more than anything else is stress, chronic stress. That experience of the brain and the body being in that chronically activated state has a really negative effect on the balance of our gut microbiome. And what that does is it allows sort of, it's oversimplified, but you can think of it as the good guys and the bad guys in there, and you want to keep those in balance. When we're in a chronically activated, chronically stressed state, the bad guys kind of start to take over, and we get this imbalance, which then has major implications for how chemicals that our brain needs to function, how those are produced, how those get to the brain, also has a major impact on digestion. So even in a best case scenario where we're eating an organic, nutrient dense diet, if we're not digesting that food well and breaking it down appropriately into these small components that then can get into the bloodstream and can get into our cells where our cells can use them, then that's a problem. And when we're in this chronically overactivated, chronically inflamed state, not only do the nutrients or do the foods not get broken down in ways that can get into the cells where we can really use them, but the cells are so aggravated that they're not functioning and using it appropriately. And this explains one of the big things that we see with things like gluten sensitivity, celiac, food sensitivities in general. And your listeners have probably heard, why is it that so many people, or kids especially, tend to be sensitive to so many foods? This is really at the root of it. They're not breaking things down well. These larger particles and proteins are leaking through the inflamed wall of the gut into the bloodstream where they don't belong. And the immune system is now having to try to manage that and going, whoop, wait, these large proteins from gluten don't belong in here. We need to fight them. And so the immune system gets even more activated, which then burns the immune system out more. These larger proteins get into the brain where they create all kinds of problems for people. So this piece of nutrition, what we eat, and also making sure that we're optimizing our digestion to break these things down, it's really at the heart of how we help ourselves through life in general, but especially through longer term stressful situations. And I know that that can feel frustrating to people. They're like, oh my gosh, I'm already so stressed out. The last thing I feel like I can think about is doing something different with my food or feeding my kids differently. And I get that. And yet at the same time, one of the ways that we really support ourselves and minimize the fallout from these kinds of chronically stressful situations is by thinking about and focusing on what we're eating, how we're feeding our kids, and helping our digestive system to work well in ways that we can use the food well.
And in doing that, do we need to be supplementing with probiotics and different things like vitamins and micronutrients that I've heard are important? And I think that's a new thing for a lot of parents, is thinking about maybe a chewy gummy or something like that, but like really understanding what is it that we need.
Absolutely. And it's complicated. And so many parents go, oh, how do you figure this stuff out, right? And every day now we see, especially since the pandemic, everybody's selling some sort of immune support supplement, or you should be on this. So here's how I look at it. I tend to be really practical about these things. First of all, it's important to understand that you really can't use supplements, nutritional supplements, to counteract a really bad diet. So while I do use supplements absolutely in my practice and just in general recommending them, I think there are some supplements that are really important and beneficial for kids and adults to be taking, but we really do need to look at what we're eating. So a child who's eating a diet that is high in processed foods, high in added sugars, lots of chemicals, low nutrient content, you can give them a Flintstones multivitamin every day, and they may chew that and enjoy that like candy just fine. You're not doing anything for them, right? So the idea that, oh, I can just kind of have my kid eat whatever they want, but I'll give them some supplements, that's not really how it works. We need to be looking at least on a basic level, some things that need to be done as far as a child's nutrition. And I fully understand that some kids have really a difficult time with picky eating, with feeding problems, those kinds of things. And in those cases, it is a slower process of shifting their diet. And certainly we can and do use supplements to help, along the way with that. But we need to be focused on food first, and then we look at supplements as an added piece of that. So, from a food standpoint, the things that I really want families to be focused on, because these are the things that create the biggest problem in terms of the body's stress response and not really giving the body what it needs to support managing all of these, difficult kinds of situations, whether it's the pandemic or whatever else. We need to look at sugar. The recommendation is that kids should not be having more than 25 grams of added sugar a day. Now, you might think, wow, that sounds like a lot. It is not a lot. It is a few teaspoons. And if you start looking at the ingredient labels on a lot of things that kids are eating, you go, oh my gosh, most kids are getting 25 grams at breakfast. Mm-hmm. And so that increased sugar, because sugar is a huge driver of inflammation in the body's stress response. And when we are eating a lot of sugar, let's say we have a sugary cereal for breakfast with some juice and maybe toast or whatever, that's a lot of sugar all at once. And what happens is the blood sugar spikes and then it crashes. And that constant experience of we eat and we get this sugar spike, and then 60 to 90 minutes later, we get the sugar crash, that is very detrimental for the body and the brain. That drives inflammation up. It increases the mental and physical stress response. It is not what we want. It detracts from kids' ability to focus and attend with their school or with whatever else. It's a huge driver of mood, anxiety, and behavior problems. So stabilizing sugar levels is really important. So just looking at the added sugar piece is huge. The other thing, you're talking about the microbiome. One of the worst things to eat in terms of throwing the gut microbiome into disarray is sugar, because those nasty, bad microbes really like to feed on sugar. And so they love it. The more sugar we eat, they're like, yes, they eat that up, but then we get these imbalances that really negatively impact our health. So sugar is a big one. The other thing is making sure that kids are getting enough produce. And I get that this is an area where kids can balk, especially if they have not been used to eating produce. But things like fruits and vegetables are nutrient dense and provide a lot of the wide array of vitamins, minerals, and phytonutrients that kids need, their growing brains and bodies need. Protein's another big one, making sure that kids are getting adequate protein. Protein supports healthy brain development and physical development. Getting enough protein allows the body to have the building blocks that it needs for making the neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine and all of those things that our brain needs to function well. We want to be thinking about maximizing those kinds of foods and minimizing a lot of the packaged process. Like if you look at the ingredient label on something and there's like this huge list and most of it is not stuff that you would cook with in your kitchen, that's a heavily chemical-filled processed food that is not going to be very nutrient dense and not very supportive to your child's brain and body. So, there's some simple starting points with all of that, but those are important things to consider. And then we also can look at the supplement piece. Vitamin D is a great example of a supplement that really everyone should be taking, in my clinical opinion. Vitamin D, unless the exception is like you all in Hawaii, who get access to beautiful sunshine all the time, because our body actually makes the vitamin D that we need through sun exposure to the skin. So sometimes kids and adults living in really warm, sunny climates, if they're spending a lot of time outside, they can get away with not supplementing with vitamin D. But vitamin D is not readily accessible in most of the foods that we eat, even in a really healthy organic diet. And we need vitamin D, especially to support immune function. So it's a big thing right now with the pandemic of, one of the things we're seeing clearly in the research studies is proactively, everybody should be making sure that their vitamin D levels are at a good, strong level. And supplementation is a great way to do that. So I'm a proponent of people taking vitamin D supplements, kids and adults. I think for a lot of kids, taking a good quality multivitamin, especially if their diet's maybe not so great, that's a good strategy to fill in some of those basic vitamin and mineral gaps, but it needs to be quality. Taking a Flintstone chewable that has artificial dyes, added sugars, and really poor quality forms of nutrients in it, not gonna get much out of that. So quality makes a difference with those things. And there are specific nutrients as well, things like omega-3 fatty acids that are found in fish oil that are very supportive of immune function, of brain function, things like zinc and magnesium that are really critical for immune function and brain function. So certainly there is absolutely a role for targeted nutritional supplementation, along with working on shifting towards a more nutrient-dense, supportive diet.
How would we know that we're deficient? Are there signs in behavior and how we feel?
Yeah, that's a great question. We look at blood levels when we have a child come in and we order labs and can look at it that way. Although honestly, there is a case to be made that sometimes blood levels don't tell the whole story either, especially for, some nutrients like magnesium and some of those kinds of things. So we want to look just more observationally at what's going on. From a physical standpoint, I can give a couple of examples, like white patches and ridges on the fingernails can be a great indication of suboptimal zinc levels. A child who has really restless sleep or has restless legs or is, not sleeping well and kind of hyperactive, impulsive during the day, that can be a real indication that there's a clinical iron deficiency. Things like anxiety and sort of that ruminating, sort of the brain is just going and getting stuck on things and causing high anxiety. That can indicate some issues with B6 and B12, with zinc. So we can connect these pieces. Omega-3 fatty acids have been very connected in the research to depressive symptoms. So when we see a patient who's having mood dysregulation, who's having depression, pretty good, case to be made that probably increasing omega-3 fatty acid levels would be helpful for them. So a child's behavior and their ability to focus and their ability to sleep and, all of those things does give us a lot of clues into what might be going on. Another thing that's worth mentioning, because more and more children have issues with picky eating, with sensory processing issues in general, kids who are very hypersensitive to touch or want to crash into things all the time or are sensitive to loud noise, or kids who just want to chew or gnaw on things all the time, those kind of fall in the category of sensory processing issues. We know from the research literature now that zinc levels and iron levels are very implicated in that. So when I see a kid, for example, who the parent says to me, he just wants to chew on things all the time. He's, chewing on his shirt, he's chewing on his nail, he's chewing on his pencils, he's, chewing on ice, whatever it might be. I go, that is a red flag, probably some suboptimal zinc levels, iron levels there. And usually then we bear that out by doing some testing and seeing. But even without testing, you can start to use some of these things as clues, because unlike adults who can usually be more aware and communicative about what they're feeling and what's going on, for kids, especially elementary age and younger, they're not aware of that. Their behavior and, their patterns of how they function are really what give us the clues and the information for what might be going on.
So that might be the first thing to look at, is that maybe whatever your child is going through, pandemic related or not, these behaviors can be looked at as what's going on with their nutrition first, rather than blaming it on them being a bad kid or something like that, because I think that happens a lot.
Absolutely. And I'm so glad you said that, because it's one of my missions in life is to help parents and professionals understand that kids do well when they can. No kid wakes up in the morning and says, what I'm going to do today is really just be a problem, make everyone's life miserable. Like, no kid does that. Kids want to do well. When they aren't doing well, when they're struggling, we need to look at what is at the root of that. And unfortunately, our system is such that when a kid has behavior problems or learning problems or developmental issues or emotional issues, they're brought into a professional, they're given a label, and then it's like, something's wrong with you. And what we need to look at is, well, actually, what would cause a child to be really hyperactive and unable to regulate their activity level? Or what potentially could cause a kid to have moods that go up and down? Or what could cause a child to really struggle with their learning or their ability to focus or their ability to sleep? That's where we need to get curious and say, well, there's a reason. Sometimes it is related to the emotional and relational environment. Sometimes there's traumas or disruptive things in the home environment, or something that is creating those issues. But very often there's things in the environment physically for them that are not working well. There's nutrient insufficiencies, there's blood sugar dysregulation, there's immune overactivation, there's chronic infection, there's toxic exposure, there's mold exposure. So we need to do a much better job, I feel, of getting curious about, why is it that a child would struggle with this? Because that then allows us to get into what can we actually do to solve that. And certainly emotional and behavioral types of therapies can be helpful, but I know too many kids and even adults who have been in those kinds of therapies for years and years and years, and they're not getting substantially better. And it's because these root issues of what's actually driving the problems have not been corrected.
Well, this is really awesome information. And I know there's so much more that you have. I've been following you on Instagram and I've been listening to your Better Behavior podcast. And so I'd like you to tell people where they can find all of that so we can learn more from you.
Absolutely. So the best place to go is drbeurkens.com, drbeurkens.com. That's my website. It has lots of articles, videos, tips, handouts, all kinds of things. You can find the Better Behavior podcast there where we talk about all of these kinds of things and more that contribute to child behavior and functioning. And then you can also, I have a YouTube channel, Dr. Nicole Beurkens. Dr. Nicole Beurkens is my handle on Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. And those are the three that I really use. So yeah, please come and join our parent community. Check out what we've got going. Lots of great stuff.
Well, thank you so much. It's great to have you here again.
Thanks so much for having me.
Take care.
Yeah, you too.
Theodora Pavkovich is our guest next week. She talks about digital wellness for our kids, a hot topic, especially during these distance learning times.
Very much direct connection that really determines how that child will develop, again, in cognitive ways, in emotional ways. It has a huge impact on their behavior, so many other things. So for me, it really started as a question around.
Well, that is our show for this week. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you back here next week. For now, take care, stay safe, and be well. Aloha.